I stopped giving this orchid ice cubes, but the biggest change had almost nothing to do with the ice itself. For a long time, I followed one of the simplest orchid care instructions you can find. Place a few ice cubes on top of the potting mix once a week, let them melt, and leave the orchid alone. It sounded controlled, it sounded convenient, and for someone who was afraid of overwatering a Phalaenopsis orchid, it sounded almost impossible to get wrong. But orchids do not live by care labels. They live through their roots. Once I started paying attention to what was happening inside the clear pot, the weekly ice cube rule stopped feeling as precise as I had once believed. The bark on top could look completely dry, while the center of the pot was still damp. One root could look silver, while another root remained green. The pot could feel light during one watering cycle and unexpectedly heavy during the next. The same number of ice cubes could not tell me whether this orchid actually needed water on that particular day. So I changed the routine. I stopped using ice cubes, switched to room temperature water, and began checking the orchid before every watering. I watched the roots. I checked the potting mix below the surface. I lifted the pot to compare its weight. I checked the decorative container for trapped water. And whenever I watered, I made sure the excess could drain completely. What I learned was that replacing the ice was only half of the change. The more important change was learning to stop watering this orchid according to a fixed calendar. Before going any further, there is one important point to understand. This is not a laboratory experiment, and the experience of one orchid cannot prove what will happen to every Phalaenopsis in every home. Some orchids can remain alive and continue flowering while being watered with ice under certain conditions. That does not automatically mean every orchid watered with ice is being harmed. At the same time, many orchid growers prefer room temperature water because Phalaenopsis orchids are tropical plants. Their roots are adapted to moisture that is not near freezing, and normal watering makes it easier to moisten the potting mix more evenly. So the most useful question is not whether ice cubes always kill orchids. That question is too simple and too absolute. A better question is this: does a fixed amount of melting ice placed on the surface once a week match the needs of this orchid, in this pot, in this room, on this particular day? Once I started asking that question, I realized I had been focusing on the easiest part of the routine to measure, while ignoring the most important part to observe. The ice cube method is attractive for a reason. Most beginners are not careless. They are trying to protect their plants. Phalaenopsis orchids are often sold in a clear plastic nursery pot placed inside a decorative container. Their roots look unusual. Their chunky bark looks nothing like normal houseplant soil. And the care label often warns the buyer not to overwater. Pouring water through this unfamiliar setup can feel risky. A few ice cubes feel small, predictable, and clean. There is no large amount of water to measure. There is no puddle on the counter. There is no need to carry the orchid to a sink, and there is less fear of accidentally drowning the roots. The method also gives the grower a schedule. Every Sunday, every 7 days, or whenever the label recommends, the same action is repeated. A schedule reduces uncertainty, but a precise schedule is not the same thing as precise care. The orchid does not know that 7 days have passed. It responds to how much moisture remains around the roots. It responds to how much air moves through the pot. It responds to the temperature of the room, the intensity of the light, the type of potting mix, the size of the pot, and the health of the root system. A Phalaenopsis, growing in large pieces of chunky bark near a bright window, may dry faster than a Phalaenopsis packed tightly in sphagnum moss inside a cool room. A small pot may dry differently from a large pot. A plant near an air conditioning vent may lose moisture differently from one in a warm, still room. Even the same orchid can dry at a different speed after the seasons change, after a heater begins running, or after old bark starts breaking down and holding more water. That is where a fixed weekly routine can become misleading. The amount of water may stay consistent, but the needs of the plant do not. If the center of the pot is still wet when the next scheduled watering day arrives, adding more moisture can keep the roots wet for too long. If the pot has dried more quickly because the room is warmer, brighter, or airier, waiting for the calendar may leave the plant drier than expected. The schedule may be easy to remember. but it cannot inspect the roots for you. There is another issue that is easy to miss. Water from melting ice does not always spread through every part of the potting mix in the same way as a thorough watering. Water follows gravity. It also follows the open paths between pieces of bark or compressed moss. It may move through one narrow area, while other areas receive less moisture. In a bark-filled pot, that can leave some roots wet, while other roots remain comparatively dry. In a pot with a dense plug of moss hidden around the original root ball, the center can remain wet long after the bark around the outside appears dry. That does not mean every orchid watered with ice develops a dangerous wet area. It means the surface of the pot cannot tell you the whole story. To understand what the orchid is experiencing, you have to stop judging the pot from the top and begin checking the entire root zone. The first thing I began checking was the clear nursery pot. When an orchid is inside an opaque decorative container, I remove the clear inner pot before making a watering decision. I look through the sides at several areas. I do not focus on one root near the surface. I look at the roots pressed against the walls of the pot. I look at the roots near the top. I look at the roots deeper inside, where moisture may remain longer. Healthy Phalaenopsis roots can appear pale silver, grey-green, bright green, yellow, or cream, depending on how recently they were watered and how much light reaches them. The outer covering of the root is called velamen. You do not need to remember the technical name, but it helps to understand what it does. Velamen is a spongy outer layer that absorbs water quickly. When a dry silver root receives water, it can turn green within seconds. That color change is useful, but it is not a complete health report. A silver root is not automatically dead. A firm silver root may be completely healthy and simply dry on the outside. A green root usually shows that the outer layer is holding moisture, but it does not prove that the entire pot is evenly wet. A yellow or cream-colored root inside the pot is not automatically rotten either. Roots that grow without much light may remain pale even when they are healthy. Texture matters just as much as color. A healthy root usually feels firm or slightly springy. A damaged root may feel mushy, hollow, papery, or completely flat. Sometimes the outer layer slides away and leaves a thin string in the center. That is a much stronger sign of a dead or severely damaged root than color alone. This is why cutting every silver, yellow, or brown-looking root can remove living tissue that the orchid still needs. If an orchid already has damaged roots, switching away from ice will not magically restore those dead sections. Dead roots do not become healthy again. The meaningful signs are whether the remaining roots stay firm, whether the damage continues to spread, and whether the plant eventually produces healthy new root tips. After checking the visible roots, I began checking the potting mix. The top layer of bark normally dries first because it is exposed to moving air. That makes it one of the least reliable places to judge the condition of the entire pot. The bark on the surface can look dry, while the center remains moist. A dark piece of bark may indicate moisture, but bark also varies naturally in color. The important information often comes from deeper inside the container. In a clear pot, condensation can provide a clue. Moisture on the inside wall may show that the center is still damp, although condensation should never be the only signal used. A clean wooden skewer can also help. The skewer can be inserted carefully into an open space in the potting mix and left there briefly. If it comes out cool and damp, the center may not be ready for more water. If it comes out nearly dry and the other signs agree, the orchid may be approaching watering time. The skewer must be used gently so it does not stab, scrape, or break healthy roots. The type of potting mix changes everything. Chunky orchid bark holds some water on its surface and inside its pores, but it also leaves large air spaces around the roots. Sphagnum moss can hold much more water and can stay damp far longer, especially when it is packed tightly. A mixture of bark and moss behaves somewhere between the two, depending on the amount of each material and how tightly the pot is filled. Some grocery store orchids also contain a small nursery plug hidden around the center of the original root system. The outside of the pot may appear to contain only bark, while the hidden plug remains wet. The existence of a plug does not automatically mean the orchid must be repotted immediately. The decision depends on the condition of the roots, how long the center stays wet, whether the material is breaking down, and whether the pot still allows enough drainage and airflow. But the hidden material must be considered when deciding whether to water. Ignoring it can make a dry-looking pot much wetter than it appears. The next thing I began checking was the weight of the pot. This is one of the simplest skills a beginner can learn. A freshly watered pot feels heavier. As moisture leaves the potting mix and the orchid uses water, the pot becomes lighter. At first, the difference may seem very small. After lifting the same pot at different stages of the watering cycle, the difference becomes easier to recognize. Weight is not a perfect measurement. A heavy ceramic outer pot can hide the difference, so I remove the clear nursery pot before checking. Decorative stones, large bark pieces, support stakes, and clips can also affect how heavy the pot feels. But when the root color, the condition of the center, and the weight of the pot all point in the same direction, the decision becomes more reliable than following the date alone. There were times when the surface looked dry enough to tempt me to water, but when I lifted the pot, it still felt heavier than expected. When I checked deeper inside, the center still held moisture. That was the moment the weekly rule began to lose its authority. The orchid was giving me information that the calendar could not. I also began checking the decorative container. A Phalaenopsis can be watered correctly and still develop problems if excess water remains trapped around the bottom of the nursery pot. Some decorative pots fit so tightly that airflow is restricted. Others have no drainage hole at all. Water can collect where it cannot be seen, leaving the lowest roots constantly wet. Before watering, I remove the inner pot and check for standing water. After watering, I allow the nursery pot to drain completely before returning it to the decorative container. Only after checking the roots, the center of the potting mix, the weight, and the drainage do I decide whether the orchid needs water. When the signals show that the orchid is approaching the right stage, I use room temperature water. I do not use hot water. I do not use water that feels extremely cold. Comfortable room temperature water is enough. I move the orchid to a sink or another place where water can drain freely. I remove the clear nursery pot from the decorative container. Then, I water the potting mix evenly. With bark, I direct the water around the surface instead of pouring everything into one location. The goal is to moisten the medium and allow water to move through the open spaces around the roots. I avoid forcing water directly into the crown, the central point where new leaves emerge. Phalaenopsis leaves form a cup-like center that can hold water. If water accidentally enters that area, I gently remove it with the corner of an absorbent tissue or make sure the plant dries quickly in good airflow. I do not leave water sitting inside the crown overnight. I continue watering until water flows freely from the drainage holes. Then I stop and allow the pot to drain completely. Thorough watering does not mean leaving the orchid soaking in a pool of water. It means the roots and potting mix receive moisture, the excess water leaves, and air can return to the open spaces in the pot. When an orchid is growing in sphagnum moss, the same basic principle applies, but the technique requires more restraint. Moss can hold a large amount of water. The goal is not to saturate moss that is already wet. The goal is to wait until the plant is approaching the appropriate level of dryness, then moisten the medium without leaving it waterlogged. A tightly packed moss pot may need a completely different amount and frequency of water from a pot filled with chunky bark. That is another reason a universal watering number cannot work for every orchid. Within seconds of watering, visible silver roots often turn green. That is satisfying to watch, but it is not the final result. The color change shows that the outer root layer has absorbed moisture. It does not prove that every root is healthy. It does not prove that the orchid will grow a new leaf. It does not mean the orchid will bloom again. And it certainly does not prove that one watering has reversed older damage. The real test begins after the water stops draining. I return the orchid to its normal location only after the outer container is dry and there is no standing water at the bottom. Then I watch how the pot dries. I check whether condensation remains. I watch how quickly the visible roots return from green towards silver. I check how the center of the medium feels. I lift the pot and notice when it becomes lighter. This is where the experiment changed direction. I had expected the important difference to be the temperature of the water. Instead, the most important change was that I no longer watered automatically on the same day every week. Room temperature water can still cause overwatering when it is applied while the pot is already wet. A thorough watering can still be given at the wrong time. Removing the ice does not remove the need to observe the plant. On the next day that would previously have been a scheduled watering day, I paused. I looked at the roots. I checked the center. I lifted the pot. I checked the drainage area. When the roots were still green, the center was still damp, and the pot still felt heavy, I did not water. When most of the visible roots were becoming silver, the center was approaching dryness, and the pot felt noticeably lighter, I prepared to water. When the signals disagreed, I waited and checked again later, rather than forcing a decision from one clue. That is important because different parts of an orchid pot can dry at different speeds. Aerial roots outside the pot may turn silver quickly because they are exposed to the air. They should not be used as the only signal for the roots buried inside the potting mix. The bark on top may dry while the center remains moist. One visible green root may be pressed against a damp piece of bark even when much of the pot is nearly dry. No single sign should control the entire watering decision. Light also affects water use. A Phalaenopsis receiving bright, indirect light may use moisture and dry faster than one kept in a dim corner. Temperature matters. Warm air can increase evaporation, while a cool room may slow the drying process. Air movement matters. Gentle airflow helps moisture leave the pot and reduces stagnant conditions. But a strong heating or air conditioning vent can dry exposed roots and leaves too quickly. Humidity matters as well. High humidity does not replace water absorbed by the roots, but it can slow evaporation from the potting mix. The condition of the roots may be the most important factor of all. A plant with many firm, active roots can absorb water differently from a plant with only a few functioning roots. A severely damaged root system can leave the leaves dehydrated even when the potting mix is wet, because the plant cannot absorb water effectively. In that situation, adding water more often can make the root problem worse instead of correcting the wrinkled leaves. This is why a soft or wrinkled leaf cannot diagnose thirst by itself. A Phalaenopsis with roots that are too dry can develop limp leaves. A Phalaenopsis with rotten roots can develop the same appearance because it has lost the ability to move water into the leaves. Before responding to soft leaves with more water, check the roots and the moisture inside the pot. The first visible change after switching methods was that room temperature water could be distributed around a larger area of the potting mix. More of the visible root zone came into contact with water during the same watering, but that immediate response was not the most important result. The more meaningful result was that each watering decision became connected to the actual condition of the orchid. Some watering days arrived later than the old schedule. Other checks happened earlier because the room had become warmer or the pot had dried more quickly. The calendar stopped deciding. The orchid started deciding. That does not mean the plant transformed overnight. Older damaged roots remained damaged. A change in watering could not repair dead tissue. The goal was to protect the roots that were still functioning, reduce avoidable moisture stress, and create conditions in which healthy new growth could eventually develop. New root tips, when they appear, are more meaningful than the temporary change from silver to green during watering. A new leaf developing normally is more meaningful than a flower that was already open before the watering method changed. A stable plant is also a meaningful result. The orchid may not produce a new flower spike during the period when the watering change is being evaluated. That does not mean the change failed. Flowering depends on the overall health of the plant, the amount of light it receives, temperature patterns, maturity, timing, and other conditions. A flower spike that had already started developing before the change cannot be credited entirely to the new watering method. The honest payoff is not necessarily an immediate display of new flowers. The payoff is a root zone that is easier to understand and manage. The most important before and after difference may not be dramatic enough for a miracle rescue story. Water may be distributed more evenly. Drainage may be easier to verify. The center of the pot may be checked instead of ignored. Watering may be delayed when the pot is still wet. The plant may remain more stable because it is no longer receiving moisture according to a rigid schedule. Those changes are less dramatic than an overnight transformation, but they are more useful for keeping an indoor orchid healthy over time. From this process, I developed a simple 4-check routine. I now use it before every watering, whether an orchid was previously watered with ice or not. The 4 checks are roots, medium, weight, and drainage. First, check the roots. Look through the clear pot at several different areas. Do not make a decision based on one root near the surface. Mostly, silver roots may suggest that the plant is approaching a drier stage. Green roots suggest that moisture is still present, but combine color with texture and the other checks. Firm roots are more encouraging than roots that are soft, hollow, papery, or collapsing. Do not cut a root only because it is silver, yellow, or darker than the roots around it. Second, check the potting medium. Look below the dry top layer. Use the clear sides of the pot, visible condensation, the feel of accessible bark, or a clean wooden skewer used carefully. Remember that sphagnum moss can remain wet much longer than bark. If the center is still clearly damp, the orchid may not need water even when the surface looks dry. Third, check the weight. Lift the inner nursery pot without the decorative container. Compare its weight with how the same pot felt immediately after a thorough watering. A noticeably lighter pot supports the other signs that the medium is drying. A surprisingly heavy pot is a reason to check the center again before watering. Fourth, check drainage. Make sure there is no standing water inside the decorative pot. Confirm that the drainage holes are open. Make sure the potting mix is not so compacted or decomposed that air can no longer move around the roots. After watering, allow the excess water to leave completely. Keep the crown dry. Do not place the nursery pot back into trapped water. Roots, medium, weight, and drainage. Check all 4 before watering. If only one of these checks suggests dryness, do not automatically assume that the entire pot needs water. If the roots stay green and the pot remains heavy for much longer than expected, the solution may not simply be using less water. It may be time to inspect the condition of the potting mix, the hidden center plug, the size of the pot, or the amount of airflow around the roots. If the pot dries extremely quickly, do not automatically begin watering every day. Check whether the bark is too coarse for the conditions. Check whether the root system fills only a small part of the pot. Check whether the plant is close to a hot or dry vent. Check whether the orchid is receiving too much heat or unusually intense light. There are also several mistakes to avoid when moving away from an ice cube routine. The first mistake is trying to compensate for the small amount of melted ice by suddenly flooding a pot that is already wet. Changing the method should begin with a moisture check, not with an automatic watering. If the center is still damp, wait. The goal is not to give more water at any cost. The goal is to water thoroughly at the correct stage, and then allow air to return to the root zone. The second mistake is leaving the orchid inside its decorative pot while watering. When you cannot see where the water goes, you may accidentally create a hidden reservoir beneath the nursery pot. Water the removable inner pot where the excess can drain, or empty the decorative container completely afterward. A beautiful outer pot should never become a hidden basin around the roots. The third mistake is judging the orchid only by its flowers. A Phalaenopsis can hold flowers for weeks, while conditions around the roots are slowly becoming less favorable. The flowers were produced using energy stored before the problem became visible. On the other hand, flowers fading naturally does not prove that the new watering method failed. Flowers are temporary. Firm roots, active root tips, stable leaves, and healthy potting mix give a better picture of the plant's long-term direction. The fourth mistake is using strong fertilizer because the orchid looks weak. Fertilizer is not a substitute for functioning roots. When roots are severely damaged or the medium remains wet for too long, stronger fertilizer can add salt stress without correcting the real cause. Establish appropriate watering and drainage first. When the orchid is actively growing and the root system is functioning, fertilizer can be used lightly, according to the product instructions. The potting mix can also be flushed periodically with clean water to help reduce the buildup of fertilizer salts. The fifth mistake is repotting only because you have decided to stop using ice. Repotting can be useful when the medium has decomposed, the center stays wet for an unreasonable length of time, the potting mix has become compacted, or significant root damage must be addressed. But a healthy blooming orchid in fresh, airy potting mix may not need an emergency repot. Inspect first. Act second. Avoid turning a simple watering adjustment into unnecessary root disturbance. Water quality can also affect the pot over time. Hard water and repeated fertilizer use may leave pale mineral deposits on the bark, roots, or rim of the container. A thorough watering that drains freely can help move some accumulated salts out of the potting mix. Very small amounts of water that never pass through the entire pot may allow those residues to remain. This is another practical advantage of occasionally allowing clean water to move through the root zone, as long as the pot drains well and is allowed to dry appropriately afterward. There is still no single amount of water that is correct for every orchid. A miniature Phalaenopsis in a small pot filled with moss does not need the same volume as a mature plant in a large container filled with bark. Instead of measuring success only by the number of ounces poured into the pot, look for evenly moistened potting mix, free drainage, and a reasonable drying pattern. When water runs through extremely dry bark without wetting it, a second gentle pass may sometimes be needed. When sphagnum moss is already damp, even a small additional amount of water may be too much. After making a watering change, keep the orchid in a stable location while evaluating it. Moving the plant repeatedly between different windows, changing fertilizer, repotting, and altering the watering method at the same time makes it difficult to understand what caused the plant's response. Change only what is necessary. Observe the same roots and leaves. Keep the lighting conditions as consistent as possible. That creates a more honest comparison than relying on memory or a different camera angle. So what changed when I stopped watering this orchid with ice cubes? The water temperature changed. The way water moved through the pot changed. The amount of the root zone that could be observed during watering changed. But the most important change was the way I made each watering decision. I stopped assuming that the same amount of water on the same day was automatically correct. I started checking what the orchid was actually telling me. This does not mean every orchid that has received ice is damaged. It does not mean you need to panic. It does not mean you should immediately pull a blooming plant out of its pot or cut roots without evidence. Begin with observation. Remove the clear nursery pot from the decorative container. Look at the roots. Check the center of the potting mix. Feel the weight of the pot. Make sure the excess water can drain. Then decide whether the orchid actually needs water. Your orchid does not know what day of the week it is. It responds to moisture, airflow, light, temperature, the condition of the potting mix, and the health of its roots. Before the next watering, check the orchid, not the calendar. And let me know whether your orchid is growing in bark or sphagnum moss, whether you have been using ice cubes, and what you plan to check before watering it again.